Have you ever wondered how a single choice can change the fate of an entire life? In the story of Lot, we see how seemingly simple decisions can trigger eternal consequences. In this video, we will follow the journey of Lot, a man who chose to live near Sodom, a city that was about to be destroyed by divine justice. We will witness the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the desperation of a flight for survival, and the mistakes made out of fear and haste. This story goes beyond a simple biblical account. It shows us how choices shape the future, generate irreversible consequences, but also reveal the depth of God's mercy. If you've ever wondered how the decisions we make can profoundly impact our future and that of the people around us, then this story will give you answers. Get ready for a powerful lesson about the consequences of sin, divine justice, and above all, the mercy of God, who, even in the face of so many mistakes, is still able to offer redemption. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, and if this video is relevant to you, don't forget to leave a like. Having said that, let's now tell the story of Lot. Lot, an intriguing character from the Bible, was the nephew of Abraham, the man to whom God had promised a lineage as numerous as the stars in the sky. Together, Lot and Abraham embarked on a journey of faith when they left the land of Ur, an ancient and prosperous city, in obedience to a divine call. God had a plan for them, and this journey represented a fresh start, filled with promises and challenges. They traveled through unknown lands, relying on divine guidance for each step. Abraham led the way, but Lot also experienced God's blessings alongside his uncle. Their flocks thrived, their possessions grew, and they became so wealthy that the land they shared was no longer big enough to support their goods and herds. However, this prosperity brought an unexpected challenge. The shepherds of Lot and Abraham began to argue. The land that once was a blessing now seemed too small for both. Abraham, ever wise and peace-loving, proposed that they part ways amicably. He gave Lot the choice of which part of the land he preferred, a decision that would mark the destiny of both. Lot looked around and saw the fertile plains of the Jordan, where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were located. That land appeared perfect in his eyes, lush with abundant water, ideal for his flocks and his business. He believed this would be the best place to thrive even more. Without hesitation, Lot chose to move there, while Abraham remained in the mountainous regions. But this decision, which initially seemed so advantageous, would soon prove disastrous. Sodom was a city famous for its beauty, wealth, and commercial opportunities. Its markets were bustling with life, and the promise of material growth seemed guaranteed. However, behind all that facade of prosperity lay something much darker. Sodom and Gomorrah were known not only for their abundance but also for their deep departure from God's ways. The cities were steeped in grave sins, with their inhabitants engaging in all sorts of wickedness, violence, and immorality. By choosing the immediate wealth of the plains, Lot underestimated the spiritual dangers that awaited him in Sodom. He approached riches and earthly promises, unaware that he was placing himself and his family in a corrupt environment. What he didn't know at that moment was that his seemingly simple and logical choice of where to live would become the first step in a series of tragedies. By moving to Sodom, Lot was distancing himself from the protection and wisdom of Abraham and drawing closer to the heart of a city destined for destruction. Lot's journey to Sodom began with hope and prosperity, but this choice would mark the beginning of many challenges. Each day he lived in that city, Lot faced the growing tension between his faith and the morally decaying environment around him. Sodom and Gomorrah were not just cities known for their beauty and wealth. They also carried a dark reputation. There, sin reigned unchecked, and the wickedness of its inhabitants seemed boundless. The cities, which appeared prosperous and attractive, hid within them a moral decay so profound that their acts of cruelty, injustice, and immorality were known to all around. Pride, indifference to the suffering of others, corruption, and perversion were the foundations of life in Sodom and Gomorrah. Nothing was sacred and everything was permitted. The scriptures describe how the cries of injustice from these cities rose to the heavens, And God, upon hearing the cries of such wickedness, decided it was time to act. It was a time for judgment. The Creator himself could no longer ignore the atrocities multiplying there. The Lord, in his infinite justice, resolved that the destruction of these cities was inevitable, for there was no longer respect for life, faith, or neighbor. But even in the face of such a heavy sentence, we see God's mercy in action. Abraham, Lot's uncle, upon learning of God's plans, felt a deep urgency in his heart to intercede for his nephew. Abraham knew the corrupt character of Sodom, but he also understood that Lot and his family lived there, surrounded by the darkness of that environment. In a moment of profound compassion, Abraham approached God and asked, "What if there are righteous people in Sodom? Will you destroy the righteous along with the wicked?" God, in his mercy, replied that if there were even 50 righteous people, he would spare the city. But Abraham, aware of the evil reigning in Sodom, kept insisting, "What if there were 45, or 40, or 30? Abraham lowered the numbers until he reached 10 righteous. And God, being patient and kind, answered that even if there were only 10 righteous, he would not destroy the city. However, when God sent 2 angels to assess the real condition of Sodom, it became clear that not even 10 righteous could be found there. When the angels arrived, the wickedness of the inhabitants was so evident that the situation became untenable. The angels entered Lot's house to spend the night, and soon the men of the city, from all ages, surrounded the house, demanding that Lot hand over the visitors so they could abuse them. The perversion and violence had become so ingrained in the hearts of the men of Sodom that they had lost all respect for God, for strangers, or for human decency. It was at this moment that the angels revealed to Lot the terrible fate that was about to befall the cities. They instructed him to gather his family and flee, for God's judgment was at the gates. The cries of the oppressed, the victims of violence and injustice in Sodom and Gomorrah, would no longer be ignored. The time of divine patience had ended. The judgment would be relentless, and the fire from the heavens was about to fall. Despite the urgency of the warning, not everyone was ready to listen. Lot's sons-in-law mocked the message and refused to believe that something so terrible could happen. They laughed and rejected the idea of fleeing. The moral corruption of those cities had blinded them to the gravity of the situation, but the angels knew time was running out. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah had already been decreed, and nothing could prevent what was to come. Lot's escape began with an almost palpable tension. Inside his home, he received a visit that would change his destiny forever. The angels of God. They did not come merely as guests, but as messengers bearing an urgent and terrifying warning. "Flee," they said with a seriousness Lot had never witnessed before. "Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Destruction is near, and nothing can survive." The words thundered in Lot's ears. There was no time to think, to question, or to doubt. He needed to act immediately. Feeling the weight of responsibility for his family, Lot ran to alert his wife and 2 daughters. The chaos outside was growing. The city, which had been moving along in its corrupt routine, was beginning to sense the foreboding of something terrible. The angel's instructions were clear. Don't waste time, don't look back, and run without hesitation. The impending destruction would be so devastating that even a simple glance of curiosity could be fatal. As Lot and his family prepared to flee, the sky began to darken and a sense of deadly foreboding hung in the air. Time was running out. They knew they could not linger, yet Lot still tried to convince his sons-in-law to come with them. However, to them, it all seemed like a joke. They laughed at Lot's warning, finding it impossible that such a large and prosperous city could be destroyed in an instant. But the angels' warning was real, and destruction was closer than they could ever imagine. Finally, Lot, his wife, and their 2 daughters began to flee. The angels practically shoved them out of the city, urging them to run without stopping. Adrenaline surged through their veins. Behind them, the sounds of the city burning could already be heard in the distance. The sky, once clear, was now filled with smoke, and the smell of sulfur permeated the air. What had started as a vibrant city was now turning into a hell on earth. Flames fell from the sky like rain. consuming everything in their path. However, amid this desperate flight for survival, a tragic moment occurred. Lot's wife, perhaps driven by curiosity or a longing for the past, did what had been clearly forbidden. She looked back. Perhaps it was too difficult for her to leave behind all that she had known, her memories, her friends, her home. But this choice, this simple glance, cost her life. The moment her eyes turned toward Sodom, she was transformed into a pillar of salt. There, on the escape route, she remained, a silent monument to the consequences of disobedience. Lot's pain was immediate and profound, but he knew he could not stop. The angels had been clear. Keep running. His only chance of survival was to move forward without looking back. With a shattered heart and his 2 daughters by his side, Lot pressed on, leaving behind not only his wife but also everything he knew and had built in Sodom. As they ran, the sky lit up with flames consuming the cities. Sodom and Gomorrah were being utterly destroyed. Everything that had been there, the houses, the fields, the people, was being engulfed by fire and sulfur as divine judgment fell upon that place of sin. The scene was one of complete devastation. Nothing would remain of the cities that once stood as symbols of prosperity, now synonymous with sin. Lot's escape was desperate, and each step seemed to echo with the sound of destruction. He knew the past was being erased, but the future remained uncertain. Even in the face of such loss, he and his daughters continued their journey toward a new beginning, leaving behind not only the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, but also an eternal reminder that the choices we make can have consequences that last forever. After the complete destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's life and that of his daughters would never be the same. The flames that consumed the cities also swept away the past they knew. They no longer had a home, friends, or even Lot's wife. With heavy hearts and a sense of desolation, Lot and his 2 daughters set out in search of a new refuge. They could not turn back, could not rely on anyone for help. They were utterly alone in the world, in an unfamiliar land. The Bible recounts that amid this chaos, Lot and his daughters found shelter in a cave, far from any signs of civilization. It was a dark, cold, and lonely place, reflecting their state of mind. The cave became their new home, but it also symbolized the isolation and despair they were immersed in. They were distant from everything and everyone. The silence around them only intensified the sense of loss and helplessness that now filled their lives. As time went on, Lot's daughters began to be consumed by a deep fear, the fear that their father's name and lineage would perish. They believed there were no more men available to marry or to give them children. The destruction of the cities and their total isolation fed this fear. For them, the future seemed bleak, and despair began to take hold of their hearts. The thought of their father's legacy vanishing was unbearable. It was then that, in a moment of desperation and hopelessness, Lot's daughters made a drastic decision. They devised a plan that, in their minds, was the only possible solution: to get their father drunk and, without him realizing it, conceive children with him. In that environment of solitude and uncertainty, discernment was overshadowed by the urgency to perpetuate the family line. The act, born out of deep desperation, resulted in a grave sin. In the minds of the daughters, the fear of losing the future led them to make a choice with unforeseen consequences. On the first night, the eldest daughter gave Lot wine until he completely lost consciousness. She then lay with him, and Lot, in his drunken state, had no idea what had happened. The following night, the younger daughter did the same. Both believed they were ensuring the continuation of their father's lineage, but little did they know they were sowing the seeds of a problematic future. From this act, 2 sons were born. The first was named Moab, who would later become the ancestor of the Moabites. The second was named Ben-Ami, who gave rise to the Ammonites. These 2 peoples, born from a desperate sin, would eventually become enemies of Israel. What began as an attempt to secure Lot's lineage turned into a legacy of conflict and tension. This story, although tragic and difficult to understand, serves as a powerful reminder of how decisions made in moments of desperation can have lasting consequences. Lot's daughters, driven by fear and loneliness, believed they were doing what was necessary to save their father's name, but they ended up creating a situation that would bring pain and conflict to future generations. Their sin was not just a moral error, but also a lesson on how human choices can impact the destiny of entire nations. Lot's new life after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was marked by tragedies and tough decisions. He lost his wife, his city, his home, and in a way, he also lost control of his own destiny. The consequences of his daughter's choices would echo for many years, and Lot's story, which began with promises of prosperity alongside Abraham, ended with a legacy that would be remembered as an example of how desperation can lead to sin and ultimately to eternal consequences. The life of Lot is a true example of how the choices we make can determine not only our destiny, but also that of entire generations. From the moment he separated from Abraham and chose to live in the fertile plains near Sodom, Lot began to tread a path filled with dilemmas and challenges. What initially seemed like a simple decision, the pursuit of prosperity and a better life, turned out to be the beginning of a sequence of events that would mark his story forever. When Lot decided to go to Sodom, he was likely thinking about his family's material well-being. He saw the fertile plains, the bustling trade, and the promise of prosperity. However, Sodom and Gomorrah were not just wealthy cities. They were deeply corrupted by sin. Evil was so prevalent that their acts of perversion, injustice, and cruelty echoed up to the heavens. Lot, though a righteous man amid this decay, was inevitably affected by the environment around him. As time passed, Lot must have realized the dangers of living so close to an immoral city, but his roots were already deep. He had built his life there, and leaving seemed increasingly difficult. Yet choices have consequences, and Lot's decision to live near Sodom brought pain and suffering to both him and his family. The tragedies that followed, the loss of his wife, the destruction of everything he knew, and even the sin of his daughters, were all direct consequences of a life lived in the shadow of sin. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was total and devastating. God, in his justice, could no longer ignore the outcry coming from those cities. They became the eternal example of divine wrath against sin, destroyed in such a manner that nothing remained of them. Their ruins were not preserved, and even today they serve as a reminder of the seriousness of divine judgment. The sin of these cities was so profound that God needed to completely erase their existence from the face of the earth. However, amid all this destruction, there is also a touch of mercy in Lot's story. Despite living in such a corrupt environment, God, in his compassion, chose to spare Lot and his family. This shows us that even amid chaos, the righteous are not forgotten. God sent angels to rescue Lot, giving him a chance to flee before judgment fell upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Yet, even in that moment of salvation, we see the weight of choices. Lot's wife, disobeying divine instruction, looked back and turned into a pillar of salt, forever remaining a symbol of the consequences of disobedience. Lot's choices also left deep marks on his daughters. The fear and despair they felt after the destruction of the cities led them to commit a grave sin by getting their father drunk and conceiving children with him. These children became the ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites, peoples that would later become enemies of the people of Israel. Thus, the mistake made in that moment of desperation echoed through generations, creating future conflicts and tensions. Lot's life teaches us that the choices we make have the power to shape our destinies, and often their consequences extend beyond what we can imagine. Lot could not foresee that by choosing the fertile plains of Sodom, he was planting the seeds of a series of tragedies. He had no idea that his proximity to sin would bring so much suffering and loss to him and his family. Yet, even amid this story of pain and consequences, we see the merciful character of God, who, in his goodness, spared Lot and gave him a chance to start anew. Despite his mistakes and the corrupt environment in which he lived, Lot is still remembered as a righteous man. The Bible doesn't treat him as someone who failed completely, but as an example that even the righteous can make mistakes and face the consequences of their choices. Lot was human. He made choices based on the circumstances he thought were best for his family, but he also reaped the fruit of those decisions. This makes us reflect on the complexity of life and how decisions that seem small or insignificant can, over time, have a gigantic impact. This is Lot's eternal legacy, a story of decisions, consequences, justice, and mercy, which continues to echo in our hearts and minds, calling us to reflect on our own lives and the impact of our choices for the future. Write in the comments if Lot's story made you reflect on your life. That way I'll also know that you've made it to the end of this video. May God bless you and keep you in these difficult days of life. See you in the next video.